It's a pleasure to be here today with these fine panelists. I won't go into length with their biographies, but we have Jimmy Creech. Now I'm reading in different orders. Jimmy Creech. We have Huskey, Marianne Duddy-Burke, Jeannine Gramick, Jeff Johnson, and Janie Spahr here to speak with us today. Each of our panelists has posed a question which I will ask them to get us started. They'll talk about their own stories, and then we'll move into a discussion and some audience participation. I have a list of questions here, so I'll just go in the order I have. The first question is to Jeannine Gramick. Jeannine, what was the most transforming lesson you learned from your encounters with the Vatican?
Well, as many of you know, I was assigned to lesbian and gay ministry way back in the mid-70s that turned into LGBT ministry by the School Sisters of Notre Dame, and there was a lot of complaints from various quarters in the church, and the Vatican doesn't take complaints seriously unless they're from a bishop, so there were some complaints from bishops. And the Vatican investigated the work that I was doing with Father Nugent. And my provincial superior at the time, because I had gone through many provincial superiors and many general superiors in the course of over 20 years, she was very concerned, very afraid that I was going to get excommunicated. And she said, we have to make a pilgrimage to the birthplace, not really the birthplace, it was the burial place of our foundress in Munich, and pray for a miracle, because I really feel you're going to be excommunicated. Tisa Balasaria, who was a Catholic theologian, had been excommunicated the year before, and it was a terrible time in the CDF. It was a time of repression. So we were on a plane in Rome, going from Rome to Munich, and we see somebody sitting in the back, and she thought it was Cardinal Ratzinger. And for those of you who aren't familiar in the Catholic community, Cardinal Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI. So we weren't sure, but I went and I sat down next to him because the seat was empty. So I asked him if he was a priest, and he said yes. And I said, well, I'm a sister. I'm going to Munich. I'm a school sister of Notre Dame. Do you know the school sisters? Oh, yes. He said, my aunt was a school sister of Notre Dame. So at that point, I knew that this was Cardinal Ratzinger. And then when he found out who I was, he said, oh, he's very pleasant, very smiling. He said, you know, I have known you for 20 years. He knew my file for 20 years. So we had a very pleasant conversation about how I got into the ministry. He was not concerned about that we were having Eucharist for gay Catholics. He thought that was a wonderful thing, but it's the public. When you're in the public arena, he said, and you teach, you give workshops. So that's what his concern was. At any rate, I won't go into the whole conversation. But one thing, well, a number of things that struck me when you asked, like, how did it impact me? He was very gentle. He was very cordial. He was very attentive. He had been praying his breviary when I interrupted him. He gave me his full attention. And I think my takeaway from that was that here was an institution that was oppressing me and the sisters in my community and the LGBT community and the good work that we were trying to do. But he was doing what he thought was his job. And my Superior General had asked if he would meet with me, and he said no, because that was not the way they conducted their business. They had theological investigations. They didn't sit down and meet face to face with anyone. So in the course of this about 20-minute conversation, I could hear under his breath, he said the word providence. Providence. And I think I don't know, but I think he was thinking it was providential that we should meet. And I believe certainly it was providential that we should meet. And what it did for me is put a human face on the institution. And I've reflected on that meeting since, and what comes to me is the Gospel of John, the part in the Last Supper where Jesus says, you know, I am the vine and you are the branches. And Christ is the vine, we are the branches. And even though Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, Pope John Paul II, not Francis, but these individuals were on the right side of the branch of the tree or the vine, and I was on the left side of the branch or the tree. We were still rooted in Christ. There was something that we had in common, something very important, something very essential that we had in common, and that was Christ, our faith. And it is, I think, by meeting people face to face and acknowledging that they're trying to do what they believe is right, even though we don't. But I think that's what will bring us together.
Our second question is for Jimmy Creech. Jimmy, when your credentials of ordination were taken from you in 1999, how did you feel and what did you do?
In 1999, I was put on trial for violating the discipline of the United Methodist Church by conducting a Holy Union for two men in April of that year in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. The day before the trial, we decided that we would reenact the Holy Union so that those who had come to the trial and the media could know what I was being put on trial for. And the couple for whom I celebrated the Holy Union in Chapel Hill agreed to come for a reaffirmation of their commitment. The Holy Union in Chapel Hill I co-officiated with another minister, and she could not attend, so Nancy Wilson co-officiated in her place. So Nancy and I, for the reenactment, co-officiated the Holy Union. Prior to that, I had just gotten off the plane, driven to Grand Island. This is all in Nebraska. Driven to Grand Island, got there just an hour or so, just a few minutes before the reenactment, and had to change clothes. And what that involved was putting on a clergy shirt, and collar, an alb, and a stole. And I was struck as I did that this would be the last time that I would be putting on the clothing, the garments that define me as an ordained minister. And I've been an ordained minister for 29 years. I understood myself to be a minister. And I knew that this was coming to an end. This would be the last act that I would have the privilege of performing before my credentials would be taken. The next day the trial took place. I was convicted and my orders were taken from me. Flew back home to Raleigh, North Carolina with great pain and grief. Just really very, I knew it was coming, but you can't anticipate the pain. I arrive home and I get a phone call from a friend. Judith is calling because her sister is in the hospital dying, and she wants me to go see her sister. And I say, Judith, yes, of course I'll go. And I hung up and I cursed. Judith, you know what's just happened. I'm not a pastor anymore. I can't do this. But I had to do it. And so I go to the hospital. Her sister's in ICU, all kinds of tubes and machines hooked up to her, in a coma, very frail. I stand with her, I hold her hand, I pray, I kiss her forehead, I leave. I go to the waiting room, I see her mom, visit with her a bit. I get in the car and I come home. And on the way home, I realized what an ordinary thing I had just done. I'd done it thousands of times. And I also realized that even though my relationship with the church had changed dramatically, I had not changed. Even though I was no longer clergy, I was still a pastor. And I would always be. And I knew that my call to ministry wasn't defined by the church. They had taken from me only what they had given to me. What they could not take from me was my baptism. And so that, Judith gave me a gift. She wouldn't let me just crawl into a hole and breathe. She gave me a gift. What happened is, from then on, just about every day, every weekend, I was somewhere in the country speaking or preaching. I began writing a book. I started working with Soul Force. I later helped develop, I then was executive director of a program called Faith in America that used media to challenge religion-based bigotry. So my ministry, I felt ordained to a new ministry, ordained in a new way, ordained by the community to which I was speaking and felt so much a part of. So my ministry didn't end when my orders were taken, and it just began, it took a new course, it began a new chapter, and I still continue and feel that I am a pastor, and that I am in ministry, and that I will continue.
Thank you so much, Janie. Our next question is for Janie Spahr, and this is an easy one.
Bring it on!
How do life stories help to shift oppressive systems in a liberation movement?
Yes, come on.
Wisdom.
No, I think these trials that we were in were, I don't think I've ever felt God more clearly. Because the church was wrong. And God is right. And inclusiveness is it. Because God includes everybody. So when people feel sorry for you, it's like, just let me speak. Disciplinary cases are different than remedials. Remedials are against bodies of people. A remedial or a disciplinary case is against you. But you know it's not against you at all. It's against all the people that have lost their lives, lost their jobs, all these things. So who is on trial is the church. And it was so clear to me. So that every trial at the downtown church, the only reason why I was on trial is I was called to be a pastor. They loved that I was doing LGBT ministry, do you hear me? And burying our friends with HIV. But when I was to go into the clergy and to take a position in the church, they got cranky. Okay, but it was a tremendous time to witness. Then as we went on, then it was for Holy News 3 different times. It was then for doing marriages. And the third time, it's like, how do you change a system on itself so it can really see this? So I said, well, if it's really against me, then it's really against the people that I married. And what happened is, these people got to tell their stories. And it was phenomenal. The whole room was just filled. And Scott is one of my attorneys back there, and Sarah and Beverly. These fabulous gay people. And they thought the straight woman was my partner. She loved every minute of it. But what I loved there, in the whole time, you have to person an issue. And the stories, it really is the 190 theory. You've just got to keep meeting us and see us and hearing us. So these stories, these wonderful stories of Lisa and Rena, who we did their wedding, and we were up in Yosemite. We kept going, Dan Smith and I, and pretty soon we were in a snowstorm. And we were with these park rangers who said, come on in our cabin, we'll build a fire, you can get married here. And the kids, it was these, and they heard all these amazing stories. They heard Celise and Cynthia. They heard about one who wanted to commit suicide, but stayed alive and become one of the great Kodak vice presidents. you know, as an open lesbian and so on, all these stories. And then you had people saying, you know, I'm accepted by my family, by my neighbors, by my friends, and I have to come here to you, the church, to accept me. All these stories kept tumbling up. So what we did at the end, right, Scott, as we were finally before the General Assembly, it was like we gathered. And what we did is we celebrated. We celebrated so that we all came together beforehand these nights. We had worship services in which people came in, LGBT people who had never heard the song, You Are Beautiful to Me. We came into these churches and had these amazing worship services where my family, my former husband and his wife, were my advanced team. And we would go into these places and so on. So what we did is we turned it over. And we became for one another. All these couples came together. How would we have ever seen one another again? And so we said to the church, thank you for giving us the opportunity to witness back to you who we are and who we love. And it is an amazing experience. So do what you will. But our stories, our narratives will turn you upside down because we are part of God's story. It was one of the trials made the difference so that we found out in the year that happened afterward at the big General Assembly, this was talked about. My presbytery would not rebuke me. And this is what they said. Scott Clark said, we will not rebuke Janie. And what they did was that things like this were said. 150 people said this, coming up. Janie, we've always stood beside you. We have always stood behind you, but we have never stood in front of you, and we are doing that now. They voted to go against the Assembly's rebuking. It was never done before. It's like we turned it over. And God won that day.
Thank you, Janie. Our next question is for Rick Huskey. So Rick, you're a practicing physician these days in Pennsylvania and involved in the Central Pennsylvania Episcopal Church. Could you tell us a bit how you saw God's grace working in your life?
Let me see those things because I tend to. I always begin with peace and grace. If any of you get my text, it always begins with P and G, peace and grace. I think I've had grace throughout my life. I've been very fortunate. I was born in Minnesota. We're raised to be the best little boys in the world, up that way. And I was brought up as a United Methodist youth. I was that well before I ever knew I was a gay man. And so grace was always something we would talk about, because Wesley would talk a lot about grace, as you know, in our theology. And I had probably gifts and graces, because the two go hand in hand. I was a theological nerd very young. I graduated from St. Olaf with a major in religion in 3 years, and a 3-year Master of Divinity program in 2 years from Garrett, and a 2-year Doctor of Ministry degree in 1 year, 9 months. And I went into parish ministry. During that time, I did a lot of, in college, I helped organize the Northfield Gay Liberation Front in Minnesota. And in Chicago, in 1972, after the General Conference, where those infamous words that have been repeated in the military, homosexual is incompatible with Christian teaching, which of course is BS, but it's not incompatible with Jesus. Maybe Christian teaching by the views of some people, but not according to Jesus. And so I also organized Chicago Gay Seminaries and Clergy, at which point one of the other co-founders was David Sint, who helped found the Presbyterian group, and a number of other wonderful budding theologues, as you would call them. I went back to Minnesota in grace, a state of grace, I felt. Had a wonderful parish in Minneapolis. President Pillsbury was a member of the congregation. His son John, who was one of my one of the youth in my program was, in fact, when he was born, his dad pushed his little tummy in, and he became the little doughboy in the Pillsbury commercials, if you can remember that. So I had this really wonderful Midwestern experience filled basically with church. I was all about Jesus and all about doing the work of Jesus in this world, and being a good pastor, loving what I did, waking up. And then within a year of my DMIN program, I went to my bishop, and I said, Bishop Clymer at the time, in your assignment to me, I asked that you allow me to minister to gay and lesbian people. And he just did not understand. You know, he just went off and accused everything from the plague and all kinds of things ridiculous. And I finally said to him, Bishop, what you're talking about is nothing that I understand it in the lives of gay or lesbian people, and neither is it anything that has to do with my life. And he understood what I was saying. And at that point, he just said, oh, I cannot. He said, I give you three choices. The first one is you leave the church. The second one is that you become an Episcopalian. And the third one is that you go ahead and take voluntary vocation. So I did that, and I was defrocked, and did a service. Some of you have seen Leo Treadway here. He organized a service. I did final communion the night before, and I thought I was going to be alone for this, and all of a sudden at the defrocking, there were over 100 gay and lesbians that came up in buses to celebrate, to kneel in. And at that point, my life was ruined. I didn't know what to do. All I knew that I could do was to serve Jesus and people. So two things happened. Within a month, I co-founded Affirmation of Gay and Lesbians, and I still didn't know what to do. So I went ahead and went into medicine and gifts and graces. I was a nerd not only theologically, but also in science. Abundant gifts and graces. And many stories have ensued from that. I went to the Dominican Republic for 2 years, came back, went to the University of Chicago, University of California, San Francisco, finished up there. Had been, over the years, a geriatrician teaching at GW and 14 years in DC. Went ahead and during that time went to Washington, DC, and as I was in Washington, DC, I did a variety of things. Chair of the Board of Nursing Home Administration. As I say, the only white boy that was the chair of the board for all those years, which I enjoyed being in the midst of that wonderful community. And I went ahead, the point is I ended up going back to Pennsylvania, and I love what I do. I do stem cell research. I opened up a clinic for heroin and opiate addicts right now. So grace is throughout my life. God has never left me.
Thank you, Rick. Our next question is for Marianne Duddy-Burke. Sorry, I have a bit of a stutter. Marianne, most of your colleagues on the panel are or were official ministers in their denominations. How do lay people experience pressure from ecclesial authorities?
Thank you. I'll tell you a couple of individual personal stories and then try and broaden that out. My first experience of institutional pressure was when I was a sophomore in college, newly out, about 8 months out as a lesbian, and also president of the Newman Catholic Association on campus. The pastor somehow heard about this, the chaplain, called me into his office and asked me point blank, I've heard you're a homosexual, and is that true? And I said, yes, it is. And he said, I'll accept your resignation. We can't have someone like you representing Catholics on campus. And I left. Fortunately, I didn't believe he was right, but it did separate me from the community and from work I love doing. Secondly, after college, I went immediately into a Jesuit seminary and was studying for an MDiv degree. And less than 2 weeks before commencement, I had finished my comprehensives, passed my oral exams, gotten superior ratings on my thesis, all of that. And 2 weeks beforehand, one of the professors there, who had been an antagonist through my entire seminary career, went to the directors of the school and challenged one of my field placements, which had been done with dignity in Boston, and said that if I was allowed to graduate with that as a recognized credential, it could threaten the accreditation of the entire seminary, which was under Vatican investigation at the time. So they decided to graduate me with an MTS, a Master's in Theology, instead of an MDiv, despite that. And it took me 9 years of battling with the school for them to ever upgrade my degree. And to this day, they've never given me the paper. It's just in the files. So I'm very careful when I write my biography to say I have a master's degree in theology rather than to say an MDiv, because I don't know what would happen if it was challenged. And then back in 1993, when I was elected president of Dignity USA, I got a series of death threats from both within my state and outside of the state, and they were deemed serious by the Boston police, to the extent that for several days they actually escorted me to work and had me moved to a more secure building. And while I can't say that any hierarchical force was directly behind those threats, the kind of rhetoric that they were responsible for at that time and the kind of misogyny that they believe, I put that squarely at the foot of church officials. And I think, these are stories that never made the media, they never got a big following, and I think that's the point, that, these kinds of things are happening to lay people in our religious institutions every single day. We don't hear the stories of those who are fired for being who they are, for loving whom they love, for becoming who they know they are to be. We don't hear the stories of the horrific non-disclosure agreements they're forced to sign in a moment where they're confronting church officials with no notice, with no legal support, with anything. We don't hear all the stories of theologians, lay theologians, whose work is denied or censored or sanctioned because of that. We don't hear about the sacraments that are denied, the exclusions that are not denied, and the ways in which we lay people have no input in many denominations into the creation of dogma and political stances taken by our church leaders that impact our lives every single day.
Thank you, Marianne. Our next question is for Jeff Johnson, and it's another easy one, softball. So, what does it mean to stand well before God when you run afoul of your church?
So, even though I had grown up and been a Lutheran my entire life, I don't think it was until my participation in the movement of resistance in our denomination that I knew what being a Lutheran meant. Not the grace thing. Lutherans think we have a corner on grace. But I think we understand God's unconditional loving kindness. I knew that. I knew what grace was all about. But it was the Christian freedom thing, right? That text from Scripture, in Christ we have been set free. Do not submit again to a yoke of domination. That's what I didn't understand. For us, our yoke of domination expressed itself in a policy of conscripted celibacy and a broad brush disrespect for same-sex covenantal relationships. And as I mentioned last night, it hasn't always been a part of denominational tradition, but it was inserted into code in a new denomination that was formed in 1988. Before that, it hadn't been written down, and things were kind of like negotiated with good bishops or in good synods, and candidates were kind of allowed to exist. But in 1988, conscripted celibacy, the requirement of lifelong celibacy for openly lesbian and gay people, was written down in code, first time for Lutherans, in this new denomination. It's kind of ironic that Lutherans chose this as the form of denomination because we thought we had settled that issue 500 years earlier at the time of the Reformation when we railed against celibacy, but we reinserted it and used it against this particular population. I was in seminary from 1984 to 1988. We had lovely and really wonderfully supportive bishops and candidacy committees and synodical jurisdictions, and because of their support, 4 of us chose to come out at the end of our seminary career. We came out in the Los Angeles Times, which may not have been a good idea, and came out just months before the reorganization of the denomination in 1988. And when the new bishops assumed control, they responded with this new code, this new policy. We had been approved for ordination in the previous churches, and those approvals then were set aside when the new church came into being. Last night I talked about John Frickman, who came to me and said, we believe that this new rule is unjust, it compromises our gospel freedom, and we want to challenge this rule. And that conversation led to a year and a half of organizing and to an ordination on January 20th, 1990, where Ruth Frost, Phyllis Ilhart, and I were ordained at a church in San Francisco. There were 7 churches across the country who had satellite services where they tied in by phone to listen to Carter Hayward preach and to listen to a letter that was read by the Bishop of Stockholm, Sweden, Christer Stendahl. We knew that what we were doing was unauthorized, that it was irregular, that it was illegal. So for us, the question, by what authority are we doing this, was a really important one. And we claimed confessional, and were granted confessional authority. In the Lutheran confessions, which go back 500 years, there's a little paragraph that says that when bishops violate the gospel, it's up to the congregations to take action. So we thought our congregations were taking this action, but we didn't think it was enough for us to claim that kind of confessional authority. So we were searching around for others to join us, people like Carter, people like important Lutherans. We couldn't find any important Lutherans to come to our ceremony. One morning we called Christer Stendahl, who was the Archbishop of Stockholm, Sweden, and asked if he would attend. And he said, you know, I'm sorry, I can't. I wish I could, but can I write a letter? And in this letter he said this very important thing, which became the basis of our movement of resistance. He said, since I cannot be with you, I'm writing to affirm what you and your congregations are doing, which must take place extra ordinem, outside the order, extraordinarily. And I'm writing to affirm my conviction that what you're doing stands well before God. Those words have formed the basis of our movement of resistance, where principled noncompliance to this form of domination and where visibility have been the anchors of our movement that has preserved people who otherwise would have been lost to our policies in the church.
Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing these incredibly rich stories. We now have some time for questions among the panelists. If you have a question for one another, or I have a couple of questions in my pockets, but I'll give you a chance first to respond to one another.
So there are tears that are here. There's probably volumes of tears, maybe an ocean of tears amongst us. And a couple things is that come to mind are, do you still cry easily? And do you have less to cry about? And also, how do you feel about yourselves at this point in terms of that personal tearing apart that went on that caused the tears? I don't want to answer my own question. I can answer it, but
Well, with my personality, I rarely cry, but I get depressed. So I was in a depression really for a good year. But I recovered. And like most of us, I think we recover through the grace of God and through the support of friends. And that's what got me through the troubled times, is the support of people.
I'm kind of known as a crier in Dignity, but it's not, my situation moves me either to a sense of shame, which I think is something we often carry, the power of religious power. When when something is done to us, we often feel weird, fell short. And so for me, I move to either shame or anger when it's something personal. But the tears are about how much beauty. I think each of us, I know for me, when people let me into their lives with their sacred stories, it touches me in a place that is so deep. That's what the tears are. And I think they really are sacred, sacred tears.
I think I cry easily deep within because I think of all the people that never got a chance to speak their voice. And I think I cry because I see what white supremacy does and what white privilege does, and that how we are so interconnected to so many justice movements and where we are right now in the world and in this country. That makes me cry. That also gives me privilege to speak. So that what I find out now when I'm preaching, before it was so much to speak about our own, to find our voices. But now more than ever, I see and speak about economic injustice, what we're doing to the world, what indigenous people are going through. All of these things now are so connected to me. The racism that is so virulent that we're seeing go face to face, I mean hugely now. I think it was more sublimated. Now it's sort of so the crying, but then the courage is deep. It is so deep. It's like, you have messed with me and my people, now you're messing with the world. And it's like, we become international citizens together. It's such a different place. It's like, I feel from the tears a roar of injustice. So that's, but across many lines.
The tears you speak of, I do have. The opportunity to be a pastor in the church, to lose that, I still grieve for, and I will always miss that. And so it's, I still, that's very tender, and I still tear up when I think about that. At the same time, I'm very grateful for what opportunities I was given because my credentials were taken from me that I would never have had. It gave me an opportunity to speak with a certain authenticity and authority that I would not have had if I had not done what I did. One of the things that's very clear to me is what the church did to me It did because of something I did, not because of who I am. The greater sin of the church is what it does to folks who are same gender loving or who are trans because of who they are and because of who they love. That's the greater sin, and that brings the greater tears. So what was done to me is trivial compared to what is done to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people by the church. So I can't really feel sorry for myself because of that, because there's much greater harm that has been done.
Wow, I have different qualities of tears. The most relevant one in my life now is are tears that have to deal with when, as a geriatrician, being present at the deaths of hundreds of my patients. They always go in peace, they're never in pain. And I think the last thing I do when they have passed is put my right hand on their heart and I say, go in peace, my friend. And I have tears from that. But I also realize, never fear the tears of a healer. A healer's tears should never be feared. And they include not only tears of pain and hurt, but also tears of joy. Our lacrimal ducts worked for a variety of reasons. And I think in the state of being crying, we demonstrate most of our humanity. One of the statements of our greatest humanity is to do that. Okay, so this last spring and summer I was reading Brene Brown's work, and many of you know about Brene Brown. She's the go-to person for the issue of shame and guilt. Shame and guilt is interesting. Shame especially is an issue. It's the thing that prevents gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, asexuals, intersex persons from coming out. But shame also may be the motivation for homophobic and violence, for homophobia and its violence, and shame of self. So, in each of us, how have we dealt with shame? That's a more important question than how we deal with guilt. Shame has to do with self. Guilt has to do with actions. I'll take my chance there.
Shame has actually not really been something that I've experienced around being gay in the church. And it might be an odd thing, because I talk to a lot of people who do experience shame. But I really experienced, it's the injustice. It hasn't been the shame that has been problematic for me. It's the injustice and the complicity of people with power, with institutional power, their complicity with this injustice. And they might try to use all kinds of weapons against me or my siblings in the struggle, our siblings in the struggle. Shame is not a weapon really that works with me. And I'm thankful for that, because it can be a hard thing to unhook from. I'm not exactly sure why, so injustice is the issue for me. In our movement, we've used kind of visibility to create cohesion, right, among openly out LGBT clergy in resistance, illegally ordained, illegally called, as a kind of a buffer to any number of weapons that the complicit insiders can try to use to silence us or to make us invisible. One quick story. So the church had this line during the 80s and the 90s that there were no LGBT pastors, right? That was the line they told everybody. And we had an unauthorized roster of 50 called and placed. They were operating in congregations out clergy who were being disrespected by the institution, and we were trying to organize all of us into a. So we showed up at a churchwide assembly one year, and 2 of us were invited to speak to the youth convo that was happening at the same time in the assembly. And we happened to walk in just as the director of the division for ministry was giving voice to this myth that there are no LGBT pastors in our church. And Lisa and I walk into the room right at that moment and say, except for, and all the kids, right, all the youth have this moment of cognitive dissonance where they really love this church, and suddenly a leader of the church is telling them one thing and they are experiencing and seeing something else. And we really played with that, exploited that, laughed about that, and re-educated a whole convo in that moment. Didn't go down the shame road at all. Went down the truth road, truth and justice.
I mean, I guess I would just say very briefly that that for me, shame can be an automatic reaction, but I'm very blessed to have a very strong community of love and support. And once I can get myself to name what's going on, they help me recorrect it and move on. So I move through it very quickly now, but it took a long time to learn to do that.
I don't even know if that's word, because I really like this interpretation of injustice and so on. I think, I have 2 sons who witnessed their mother being called a pederast. Terrible things. And Jimmy turned to me at one of these trials and he said, "Mother, I thought you said that Presbyterians were educated." This is evil and shameful on this denomination. And I think, like I said, I don't know much about shame, but it's that injustice piece. And so then how do we reach across to those people, who think of us as these terrible things, and yet others that have gone way beyond, like our children and so on, and think it's cool to be gay, or whatever, way beyond, and so on. So I'm always trying to, when people are trying to shame me, I'm trying to think, what's going on in you that has made you think this way? And usually if I stay with them, if I just keep staying with them, because I think some of the conversations when we say, I know you think it's sin and I think it's a gift. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And what I found is even people that are the most vitriolic against me is that who are you? Who's your family? What do you do in your life? Who do you love? And so on like that. And I have prayed with people that think I am the anathema. But there's something that happens in the room that, because we're trying to change this domination system is what we're trying to do. So I keep, you keep loving people through their fear or their shame, whatever this deep place is that has somehow made me other and then they're other to me. And so how do we get, to get across this? There's my friend from me, soul force, this, going, this spirit of, I'm going to love you, baby. You know, and I want you to dare to love me back. I want you to dare to see me. Let's get beyond our own shame, fear, and guilt. I mean, all that stuff that is within. I'm going to reach into you. I want you to reach back. I'm going, you know, that kind of thing. Because, boy, it is really terrific right now. I mean, I am, whew, you know, and I'm trying really hard. But we're trying to break systems of shame and guilt, and it's systems. It's this domination system that keeps saying patriarchy's still here, racism is high, all this kind of thing. Ooh. Okay, so that's.
As we're planning our discussion today, our panelists really wanted to bring the audience into the discussion and to participate in the topic. And so we wanted to do a little bit of an audience exercise. We wanted you to talk to your neighbor for about 10 minutes and think about 2 questions. The first is, have you experienced discrimination or oppression within your religious institution? And if so, were you able to rise above it or to push against it, and how? And just take about 8 to 10 minutes, maybe talk to your neighbor about your experiences, and we'll reconvene as a group.
I wonder if you want to go first. And I also spent a lot of time internalizing a lot of bad teachings around sexuality. So I knew them stuff like chapters and books, and I within the Catholic Church exactly, and trying to kind of get this X thing to be my experience. never fully did it, but I was always like, okay, just try profession, all these things. And then it was always like, with a couple of exceptions, it was all like very coded. So I feel like, sexual thoughts of sexuality. And no one asked me questions, right? I mean, none of the like professors or past years of like approached. I got invited to like therapy once, like but in divinity school, I sort of like, I had a very strong experience with the person who got and that like, it was like a shift. It was a shift in like how I think I thought that like living as like an would be and I realized that there's so much that is like within me that I didn't even know about. I wasn't letting it express. And so I was like trying to figure out how the world like fits together all over again. And so within that like our relationship started in October, and I remember a very distinct memory of sitting in the pews during Advent. And Advent is of course this time we're like waiting and expecting, but it's also there are all of these like hymns about justice and sort of like not just for Jesus to be born, but for like the reign of God to come, right? And I just like kept returning to like how I felt this like deep and sort of like reverberating into all of this place that like for me was a deep like place of feeling home that I really hadn't felt in many other places. Like I suddenly felt like or that I had to only include parts of myself. And so that for me like continues to be sort of like an emotion that I feel in relation to the church. And I've had, I was lucky to have a priest at the time who was like willing to talk to me kind of on a one-on-one basis. He was not like, he was like a very progressive as far as my Catholic priest. But yeah, but he was not like condemnatory in any way, but still the limits of how far he was willing to go was very clear that I was sort of part of it. And so, right. Or it's still to be like, well, we can talk about this in like in my office, but you bringing this up, and then it's never said explicitly, like you bringing this up in small issues or whatever, that's not acceptable. And then the other thing is, you having that community looking for has been such like an experience space to be in, because it's very clear when you go into the church how conservative the church is going to be, which then was useful litmus test to figure out like, am I ever going to be able to be a part of this community? So having that kind of like other Catholic churches, right? Yeah. So I'm very concerned with denominations, but I don't want to do.
Let's pull back together.
Anyway, I don't know if I'm risen about it. Yeah, I mean, so right now,
we're doing very well on time, all panelists. So we do have ample room for conversation and for discussion. I'll just remind you, if you'd like to speak or ask a question, please give your name and please wait for the microphone. Open it up. Yes.
My dear Janie, we've been through so much together. When you all came to Lynn Jordan, I'm at MCC San Francisco since 1970. So yeah, I'm one of the old guard. They call me the Queen Mother, among other things in this church. Some which I can't repeat here. But when you all came to MCC, what did you bring with you to inform you about the ministry at MCC, and what did you take with you as a result of your experience with us crazy MCC people that you and I worked together during those years?
Wow.
Thank you, Lynn. And we were just talking about this. What happens when you think you're going one way in your ministry and you think, oh my God, I'm never going to do this again, you know, with all these kids and everything. And this is what I found out years later, and this is what makes me cry. My Jimmy Spahr, my wonderful former husband who loved me into being me, okay, evidently called MCC San Francisco, and I didn't know this 2 years later, and said, you want to hear Janie? I said, now this is what, close. So I went to MCC. Now you have to hear how my wonderful little boys, there was a partner and she had children, and so we went to MCC, and this is no kidding. That was like in 1980. Yeah, because I was there from 80 to 82. And I remember looking, I stood and I said, you know, Eugene, before I preached, I said, I'd like to introduce my family. And my children were there, and their daddy was there, and my partner, her kids, and so on. And now you have to know the terrible things that were said. And this congregation stood and clapped for my family for 5 minutes. Wow. And the look on my little boys' faces was something. So, MCC, so then I left, and a week later I got a call from Jim Dykes. And what I understood is, or 2 weeks later, is the next week, Jim Dykes said to this congregation, we want to have Janie here. And they came forward and they gave pledges. And I went to work for MCC. It was, you know, and I took all those decently in order Presbyterian programs. We had a pastoral care program. I had 3 therapists. It was one of the greatest. You know that little neighborhood leader program that you do? Man, you can't believe what it's like in the queer community. It is so fabulous how it is. And we had this amazing thing, but then, of course, HIV was hitting then. I mean, everything. So what they did is that MCC grew me up to love fiercely God and being a lesbian. By the time they were done with me in those 2 years, it was like, look out! You know, kind of thing. And this is what was so great. Lynn gave me a picture that they gave me, when I was leaving, they gave me this certificate. And they put their hands on me, and they made me a missionary to the mainline denominations. And this is what he knows. So 10 years later, I came to give a report. This is when I was told no by the Downtown Church, and this was my sermon, a view from the missionary position. Because a view from the missionary position, who would ever not want to preach that kind of sermon? It was, but that community, MCC, again, told no again, that you never forget those communities who say, come be you, Janie. We will love you. Don't we know this, Victor? We will love you into into who you are, and then go back and get them.
Know what the hell they got.
Yeah. But so I am forever grateful, and my children will never be the same. But they do not feel for the Presbyterian Church that they do feel for Metropolitan Community Church. It's fabulous. Yeah.
I have a quick little, 2 little observations about that. When I went to Garrett Seminary, I started right immediately the summer after I graduated from St. Olaf. And again, I'm a nerd, I'm a theological nerd, so I was wandering through the library, and they had the periodicals all nicely organized in the middle. And there was a letter, a subscription letter that they had to the MCC church, and it was sitting there on the top shelf. And, you know, learning learning about the different kinds of theological journals, there was this newsletter. And boy, did I pick that up quickly. I read it and I thought, oh wow, there is already ministry going on in this world of the sort that I envisioned, and that started me out. The other thing is, when I went back to Minnesota, while I was in Minnesota, MCC Church was burgeoning, was developing, and I went there and I thought, oh, this is a wonderful community. I just feel so much at home here. And then I thought, you know, this needs to be brought, this sense of community that's here needs to be brought into my own church, my own United Methodist Church. And so there was a point there where I was wondering maybe I should jump ship in a sense and go that route, but it gave me strength and vision as to how life could be led theologically, lovingly in this world.
I hate to do this, but I am. Cynthia Myers is here. And Cynthia is a United Methodist pastor in Kansas still. She was serving a small rural church and came out as a lesbian. Charges were brought against her, and I think they're still standing. But I would like to invite you, I hate to put you on the spot, to tell your story and give us an update on how things are going.
Well, okay. Well, Jimmy has that outline right. On Epiphany Sunday in 2016, I preached a coming out sermon in the very small town and very small church in Edgerton, Kansas. We had prepared well for that. I knew that they were supportive and could handle what was about to come. I worked with Reconciling Ministries Network on that as part of our actions before the 2016 General Conference. And so preached the sermon, and that's all up on YouTube, and sent it off to my bishop, who was not a friendly sort to folks such as myself, and was brought up on charges immediately, went through the process that involves, and ultimately we reached an agreement. The church officially would call it a just resolution of sorts, but I refuse to call it that because though I agreed to it, I don't believe it's just, and it's certainly not a resolution. The charge still is pending and will be so until something happens, perhaps at a special called General Conference in the United Methodist Church in 2019 that is to deal with these issues. And if the church would move towards full inclusion or make some decision that makes the charge invalid, then it would be dropped and I would be reinstated. And otherwise, at that time, we would be back into the process and either working to reach a further true just resolution that would end the case or go to trial. In the meantime, I am serving in an interim position in Topeka, Kansas at Central Congregational Church. Central's the historic home church of Charles Sheldon of In His Steps fame. So quite a little place. They are small now, and we've sold our building and our meeting and have our home right now at the Reformed Jewish Temple in our community. A great interfaith relationship, and are expanding our social justice work and making known our full exclusion and exclusion. That was good. Full inclusion and welcome as in a way that differentiates us really from just about any other church in our city. So that's where we are, and I'm making decisions yet about whether or not I will remain with the United Methodist Church until 2019. Or if maybe I've done my work in that denomination and need to be free to minister in other ways.
Questions? Please say your name.
I'm Bob Mialovich, a member of Dignity. question to anybody in the panel who wants to approach it. All of you invested a lot of yourself in a denomination that did you dirt at some point. As you come to wholeness with yourself and move on, do you find sustenance in other parts of the doctrine of your church, or where do you find the outside help to say you're right and they were wrong on that one point of doctrine, but there's the rest of the doctrine, or do you reject all of it and find? How do you reconcile your battle with one point of doctrine and still being a faithful minister of Christ?
Well, I think there's doctrine and then there's faith, and I don't think the two are the same. There may be a little overlapping. But I think that Pope Francis is a good example of someone who sees a denomination like Catholicism and said, okay, we have this big, big body of doctrine, but what is really important is faith. And faith is faith in a person, not in a set of rules or regulations or things that are written on paper that have come down through the centuries and changed. Faith is faith in the person of Christ and God, who Jesus came to tell us of God's love. So for me, I don't pay too much attention to doctrine. And I kind of believe that our doctrines have changed and will change over the course of time. And but it's the faith of people and the living of our lives as we believe we should in following the gospel that will enable these doctrines to change. But I'm not big on putting a lot of emphasis on doctrine. To me, it's faith that's important.
Yeah. You are an honorary Lutheran. So Lutherans have this, even though we act institutionally, right? Institutions seem to be really important right now. We kind of distinguish between denominations and tradition, right? Because Lutherans go through denominations so quickly. We have one, it lasts for about 5 years, and then it merges, and it lasts for about 7 years. And this one's lasted for about 30 years, but there's no guarantee that it's going to be around. But the tradition has, and it's not just one tradition, right? It's all different kinds of currents of different traditions. So there's not one way of being Lutheran. There are all kinds of ways of being Lutheran. And you kind of find the tradition, I find the tradition that I hold to. I really appreciated your comments about faith, and it reminded me of something that Luther wrote when he was commenting on the Apostles' Creed, right? The third article of the Apostles' Creed, which is all about the Holy Spirit. And Luther says that what that article means is that we cannot by our own strength and energy come to believe, come to have faith, but it's a gift of the Holy Spirit, right? So I really believe that for me, faith has been a gift, and presently I have faith. I may not always have faith. It may go away. The gift might be rescinded, and at that point, I'll move on, or I'll do something else. But right now, I have faith in this particular tradition, and I have faith in Christ, and this has been a gift to me in my life, and responding to that gift has been a great miracle for me, and a great magic.
Well, I like being a lesbiterian. You know, there are wonderful wonderful things. It's really a matter of conscience for us. There's such great, rich things, and we're doing some wonderful things in the world. I think for me, though, too, it's this thing that I heard a wonderful Roman Catholic priest say. He said, God is that which happens between you and me. And of course, Buber's work, the great Jewish theologian, every particular I-thou relationship is a glimpse into the eternal thou that is God. And that is so sacred. So when I think of Presbyterians, you know, I see little Watson Presbyterian Church where we grew up and my grandma knitted little things for the bazaars. Do you know what I mean? Do you know, and all those little things that make it rich for you, and the McCormicks who were in the kitchen, and my dad didn't even feel worthy to be an elder. I mean, stuff like that I have in my head. Do you know what I mean? So I mean, it's all that stuff, and like you say, where you're raised and the tradition, and it's to me, it's always about the people. And then some of the doctrine is magnificent.
Yeah.
Do you know? So you kind of navigate your way, and when doctrine is unjust, then you must change the doctrine. I mean, honestly, because domination institutions then become domination systems if they become complicit with things that are unjust, and that's our work always. I think to go against whatever the doctrines that keep injustice in place. So, but Lesbiterians have more fun.
Hi, I'm Doug Creed. I'm a professor of management at the University of Rhode Island. And I wanted to ask a question about your take on polarization as it's described in the public discourse today. You've certainly emphasized the power of stories and face-to-face and that kind of thing. But the kind of psychological dynamics of polarization involve confirmation bias and a kind of imperviousness to disconfirming information, so that the kinds of things that we're facing politically and socially today would perhaps suggest an amping up of the problems you've seen, or is it just the same old, you've been there, it's actually not that different? What's your take on that?
The kind of opposition I experienced throughout my ministry, both when I became a very public advocate for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender equality in 1988, the kind of reaction, opposition I experienced is very reminiscent of what we're seeing today. Folks who I helped to create an organization in Raleigh called the Raleigh Religious Network for Gay and Lesbian Equality. And the whole group was made up of clergy. When we created it, we didn't know that there was anyone who was gay in the group, but we did later find out that there were a couple of gay clergy in the group. But we held a conference that we planned to talk about homosexuality in the Bible. And so I advertised it in my congregation, and this one woman said, I am not going to go there, they'll brainwash me. I mean, people were just afraid to be exposed to anything that was contrary to what they were holding on to as belief. And in my experience in Omaha, Nebraska, it was a confessing movement, which is like the right wing of the United Methodist Church, Good News movement, just like the Tea Party, just very much like the kinds of things we hear right now that are supporting Trump. But the one story that I have that sort of breaks through that kind of polarization is at Fairmont. There was a woman who came to me one day to my office with her Bible, sat down with me to talk about the phrases that condemn homosexuality in her mind. And we went through them, and I tried to explain as best I could, talked about the Greek, original Greek, and all of this stuff. And she laughed, saying, well, okay, I don't really understand anything you've said, I just know what my Bible says. About 10 years later, I helped to organize a protest at the General Assembly in Raleigh when a bill was coming up to define marriages between a man and a woman. We were there to protest that bill. She showed up at the protest. to protest. And I said, she came up and spoke to me. She said, "You remember me? And you remember that conversation I had?" I said, "Yeah, I remember you very well. How did you come to be here?" And she said, "You see those two guys over there? They're my neighbors." And when they moved, this is when I cry. This is when I tell stories like this. When they moved next door to me, I didn't really reach out. I didn't get to know them. But I became sick. I was in the hospital for a while, and they came to visit me, and they cut my grass, they took care of my house, they watched things for me. When I came home, they would do my grocery shopping, they would take me where I needed. They became her best friends. She says, "I still don't understand all that Bible stuff, but I love those guys, and I want them to be happy, and I'm going to protect them." And that broke through the polarization. Human reality is what breaks through.
Hi, my name is Drew Kono. I'm wondering, so all of you talked about a struggle with an institution or institutions. I'm wondering if you can speak some to your personal lives, if you're willing to, and sort of the sacrifices that that struggle entailed. And I'm thinking about our partners and the communities that we come from, and sometimes the ways in which where our lives lead us, bring us to sort of unexpected circumstances that can be very challenging. So, and maybe, or also very beautiful. So if you could speak to that if you're willing.
Before I got involved in this ministry, I'm a Catholic sister.
Right.
And in 1971, I was at the University of Pennsylvania to get my degree to teach at the College of Notre Dame of Maryland. And I just have to tell you this good story. Well, there was an article in the newspaper about this nun meeting with gays in the convent. And it is in Philadelphia, and I chose to go to the University of Pennsylvania because I'm from Philadelphia, my parents were in Philadelphia. I'm an only child. I was an only child. My parents are deceased. And like many only children, I was spoiled rotten, and my parents wanted the best for me. They never wanted me to enter the convent, but whatever you want to do, it's your life. So they did not know about this nun meeting with gays in the convent until they picked up the newspaper that Sunday morning, and they were coming to see me that Sunday afternoon. And so my dad says when he gets to the convent, what's this? And why are you doing this? Well, they're part of the church and they feel rejected, and somebody in the church has to help them. Well, let the other nuns do it. That's his reason. Let the other nuns do it. He said, you go teach at that college, So ultimately I finished a degree, did teach for a while at the college before the community assigned me full-time to the work. But I guess what it did for me is it changed the direction of my life. In looking back and seeing that I had all this stress with a religious institution that I loved, because I grew up a very traditional, faithful Catholic, and I still consider myself a traditional, faithful Catholic. But it changed. It took me from a life that, in one sense, I could have been well respected in the academic community as a math professor, and put me in my religious community, in my religious life. I don't mean the sisters, but in my church, as someone who was like on the margins. And so I felt that I was in the margins. But again, that's a point of identification with the people that God called me to be with.
I would say, like Janie, the hardest thing for me is when it impacts the kids. We have 2 kids, and when my oldest daughter found some really vile things written about me on the internet one day and brought them to me, it was really devastating. But her question was, why isn't anybody from the big church speaking up and saying these people shouldn't be calling you these nasty names? You know, and to see her flip it and sort of get to the right values about this, and to realize that the institution was allowing this kind of vile language to exist out there, but that she was a little bit shielded from it. You know, it gave some solace, but that is really where it hurts, you know, when your kids and your family are brought into this ugliness.
I love that question. For me, so much of life has to do with 7 seconds. I hope some of you understand what the 7 seconds is that I'm talking about. It's the basis of wars. It's the basis of the patriarchy. It's the average length of time for a male orgasm is 7 seconds. And how much of our lives revolve as men around those 7 seconds. I think of ancient history, Troy and Athens, and what went on there for the sake of 7 seconds. The wars that have been created over time and maintained because of 7 seconds. And in my own life, I put that in perspective. And that has caused problems with relationships with other men, because I'm able to partition that. I do that as a physician. I do that. You know, that doesn't enter into my realm. But I am able to deal with patients that have to deal with their 7 seconds and what it means for them, the problems they have with their significant others or whatever. And I just ultimately realized the power of those 7 seconds in human history and in human lives. And I just basically quarantine that to a particular area, and I only go there on special occasions.
Personally, I think of 2 things. I think, you know, your life is, and women, and because how old I am, are really scripted. So I married Janie Spahr. I thought this thing would go away. And to leave him, and what we went through to love one another, was a very profound experience. And it, even to this day, we're very close. Because we said to our children, Mommy and Daddy love one another. He said everybody will say that Mommy and Daddy aren't together because Mommy's a lesbian. But it's as much that I'm heterosexual and I can't meet Mommy, but no one will ever tell you that. So I've had huge support. But to change the script, because I married my best friend, and we're still best friends. And it's taken, but the script so changed. And then personally, when I went to Rochester, because when they called me to Rochester and then I couldn't go, I was told no, and then they invited me to be their lesbian evangelist to travel the country. The partner who I was with, I thought I would be with forever. And but she didn't feel called to Rochester. And so the tearing of that, when we were both out and proud and all that, but it tears at you in a way. And I remember my associate, wonderful, they called us the checkerboard staff, my first church, because then it was about women serving. And then I was just, a woman was enough. And they put two women together, African American and Anglo. And when I called her, I said, Wani, I'm thinking about going to Rochester. And Connie and I had long talks about that. And then Wani said this, are you called to be curriculum to the Presbyterian Church? She said, because as an African American woman, I can tell you in the early years, people wanted to touch my skin and my hair. Wanted to know, so I just want you to know, if you say yes, Janie, you will be curriculum. And she was exactly right. But losing the script with Jimmy, and then the change of script with Connie, edges you out in ways that you never thought you would know. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you know, put you in fire and then just, so I may look the same, but I am not who I was. I'm looking at you differently because the loss was so great. You know, because when you love someone who's heterosexual and you know you're lesbian, it's like, I love you, baby, but we just didn't fit, and that was such a terrible ripping. We know this. But when you lose, because this is the one you were coming with, do you know what I mean? It's like, whoa, that tear is like, so I think I'm a better pastor because I ask different questions when people lose people. You know, but it's been part of the struggle that has about killed me. But we get up.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.